He had engineered a box that was just the size of a mattress that fit on top of our 57 Chevy station wagon. And he'd pack his cast iron skillet from his homesteading days, and he'd take a dozen eggs and a little bit of wood, and we'd all pile in the car and go just sleep on top of the car under the stars, and it was fabulous. And then he'd make us scrambled eggs for breakfast. So.
Hi, and welcome to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast, a weekly conversation with women who found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm Dawn Davis, and this is episode 94. If you'd like more information about the podcast, it's all at the website desertladydiaries.com, and I invite you to engage with the guests, with other listeners, or me on social media, on Facebook and Instagram at Desert Lady Diaries, or on Twitter at Desert Lady Diary. Anne Congdon spent the first 6 years of her life on her father's 1928 homestead just north of Joshua Tree National Park. In those early years, she was underfoot at the family businesses where her parents, Bill and Prudy Underhill, were publishing the Desert Trail newspaper and running the Twentynine Palms Theater at the corner of 2 Mile Road and Adobe Road, now known as Combat Barber. From the beginning, Anne and her husband Mike shared a love of travel, and through Mike's job, they resided and traveled in many places in Western and Eastern Europe, Asia, and lived in Washington, D.C. for 35 years. On her return to the desert about 14 years ago, Anne got involved in the community, working on the Tourism Business Improvement District Committee, the Public Arts Advisory Committee of the City of Twentynine Palms, and is currently president of Sky's the Limit Observatory and Nature Center. A graphic designer, architect, and artist, Anne's artifacts, compositions of salvaged construction materials and found objects, have been exhibited in galleries in Annapolis, Maryland, the High Desert, and are in private collections on both coasts.
Twentynine Palms is a great place to be raised. It's a good place to leave, and it's the perfect place to end up. So here I am.
So here you are, Anne Congdon from Twentynine Palms. Thank you so much for coming and being on the podcast today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Glad to have you. So the question usually is, what was your first experience with desert? And really, your first experience, you didn't really know anything different.
That's correct. The hospital here wasn't built until the year after I was born, so Mom had to go to Redlands. But I came back right away and spent the first 6 years of my life on Dad's homestead, which is up near Chuck Kaplinger's Dome, just below the park. And I guess my first memories are just the heat and the bright light, the bright sun, and then specifically one day that I remember is we had a big old Buick. And the deadline at the Desert Trail was approaching, and Mom was up at the homestead with me, and we had no phones, of course, and no cell phones, and she went out, and there were 4 flat tires on the Buick. So Prudy had a lot of ingenuity, so that kicked in, and she found her old bicycle, probably in the cellar, got it out. It's amazing that had tires on it. And she put Maggie, our Cocker Spaniel, in the basket and me on the handlebars. And we rode all the way downhill from way up there to the Desert Trail office. And she made it in time for the deadline. So.
Oh, my gosh. Talk to me about growing up here and going to school here. And
it was idyllic. I don't know. I guess I don't have specific school memories, but I do have a lot of memories of Pioneer Days. If
let's talk about that. Absolutely.
It was a really big deal for my family. My dad always put a tremendous amount of effort into it. He would create these elaborate scenarios where he'd have an old rusty car with a goat in the back, and he pretended he was going homesteading, and so he'd stop the car, he'd go back, milk the goat, and then pretend to throw it out at the crowd.
Oh, my goodness.
Just made a funny thing. Another time before my memory, though, but I have a photo of it, is that he somehow or other got the press out of the Desert Trail building and put it on a flatbed truck. And he was actually printing broadsides and handing them out all the way down the parade route. But it also looked in that picture like the wind was blowing, as it is wont to do here. So I'm not sure how that worked out. But that's the kind of effort that he would put in. And then I remember these incredible nights under the stars. I mean, after the movie at the drive-in, when we were done working, Dad would say, "Hey, let's go sleep in the monument tonight." And that was a big deal. He had engineered a box that was just the size of a mattress that fit on top of our 57 Chevy station wagon. And he'd pack his cast iron skillet from his homesteading days, and he'd take a dozen eggs and a little bit of wood, and we'd all pile in the car and go just sleep on top of the car under the stars, and it was fabulous. And then he'd make us scrambled eggs for breakfast. So those are good memories.
That's a beautiful memory. Oh my gosh. Thank you for sharing that.
That might have influenced what I'm doing now.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But let's back up a little bit and talk about the business of your family.
The business. Yeah. Businesses, plural.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Dad came out here to Homestead in 1928. He was only 28 years old. He built his homestead, which was a lovely little cottage, I guess you would say, a 2-bedroom cottage. It wasn't a shack. It wasn't a jackrabbit shack. It was really a nice house. And at that time, in the early to mid-20s, the homesteads were 160 acres. Right. So he had a 160-acre homestead. You didn't have to farm because there was nothing to grow, but you did have to create a road and build a house and then have your neighbors certify that you had spent the time there that you said you had. So then I came along later, much later, a little bit later. And the first venture that Dad did was roller skating and movies at the Smith's Ranch building, the big building.
I've been out to the drive-in finally once.
It wasn't part of the drive-in then. It was just a sort of a freestanding building. And he, I guess, leased property from Bill and Thelma Smith and built this building. And you can still see the projection room up, the holes for the projection room up at the top of back of the building. So he would show the movies. I think this is the sequence. He would show the movies, and then everybody would push the seats off to the side, and then he'd rent roller skates, and then everybody would roller
Very enterprising.
So, yeah. And then the next thing they had was the theater at the Plaza, which is now the Combat Barber Club Beau, the big building with the domed roof. That was a wonderful indoor theater.
Oh, wow.
We had red ordinary seats, and we had blue loge seats, and he had a sort of gold yellowish curtain that would open before the movie started, and it was sort of the thing everybody did on Saturdays. The Saturday matinees were fabulous. I mean, every kid in town came. It was really cheap. Wow. My first job, well, I didn't even mention about the Desert Trail.
I was going to say the paper. Wait a minute.
The Desert Trail in 1935. So my first job with the family was I was probably 5. And Dad said, "Oh, you want that teddy bear, do you? Well, I can tell you how you can earn it." And he gave me a stack of Desert Trail papers, and so I folded them, and every few minutes he'd come by and put a quarter on the desk for me. So I earned really quickly, but at least I earned it. And then I moved on to doing the popcorn at the Saturday matinees, selling candy, ultimately selling tickets, and then my final thing was to run the projection machines at the drive-in theater. We had a twin drive-in theater across from the post office.
Okay.
And a roller rink. So our whole family life centered around our businesses, and it was fun. We all worked together, and we all had our jobs. And
well, what's nice too about that is they're all things that involve the community.
Exactly.
Whether it's the community bringing news to the newspaper or reading the newspaper or coming out to see a movie or coming out to roller skate. So it wasn't like you were... Sometimes when you have a business, it's like, gosh, I can't get out of here to do anything with anybody, but you were kind of in a position to where everybody kind of came to you guys.
Bring the community to us.
Right.
Yeah, Mom and Dad were very, very committed to building the community of Twentynine Palms, and I guess I inherited some of that.
Yeah. So just a little bit about what did your dad did he ever talk about what it was that made him come out here to Homestead? Oh. And did he meet your mom here did they know each other already?
No. He was in the First World War, and after the war he kind of bummed across country, tried different things. He ran a restaurant for a while, did some different things, ended up in Pasadena and learned to set type on the linotype. And he admired the profession of printing. He just thought that was, Ben Franklin was his kind of hero. Mm. So he was setting type in Pasadena one afternoon, and the message came across that homesteads were going to be made available to World War I vets in the desert. And he had always wanted to homestead because his grandfather had homesteaded.
Oh.
So at the end of his shift, he threw everything, a shovel and, I don't know, sleeping bag in the car and came out here. Well, of course, it was pretty desolate.
Yeah.
The Bagleys were here then, probably a few other people.
Yeah, I just finished actually reading The Desert Was Home.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I read Helen's book a while back, Sand in My Shoe, and then I literally just finished last weekend reading Elizabeth Campbell's book.
Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah. So he picked a homestead, went back and filed on it, but it turned out it wasn't the one he thought it was.
Oh.
But he liked the one he got anyway, which is up on the hillside, a beautiful, beautiful view of the whole valley. Very kind of backing up to what was then it wasn't the monument yet, but to what is now the park.
Right.
So after building his homestead that's what people did. They helped each other build their homesteads,
right.
and they helped build the swimming pool and the Legion Hall and the schoolhouse and all those things. Around 1935, he figured he needed a job, so he said, I'll start a newspaper. So that's what he did. In the beginning, he would collect notes, put them in his pocket. Wednesday nights, he'd drive down to either probably Redlands or San Bernardino, where he had friends who had print shops. And he would spend all night setting the type and composing the paper. He'd print, a few dozen copies. And then in the morning, he'd start back up the hill and he'd drop things off at Whitewater and Banning and Beaumont and make it back to Twentynine Palms for Thursday.
What a dedication and commitment and a passion.
Hard work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So.
And how did he meet your mom?
Oh, that's right. So Mom was quite a bit younger. She was 16 years younger than he was.
Oh, wow.
And she was working with her good friend at a PR firm in Pasadena. And somehow or other, Dad knew her boss. And so he stopped by there one day and got interested, and she got interested. And so he was spending a lot of time stopping by. And interestingly enough, in the very first issue of the Desert Trail, on the backside, there's a column, kind of a social column, called Trailin' You. And it mentions that Miss Prudence Mason drove her friend out from Pasadena. And Mom explained that in those days, a woman just didn't travel by herself. And Mom was a good driver and very spunky. So she selflessly offered to drive out, and happened to run into Bill Underhill while she was out here.
Oh, gosh.
That was in 1935, and then they were married in 41.
Wow.
So she was a fireball. She took on a lot of the work of, writing the stories, getting the ads, all those things. So they were a great partnership.
Yeah.
They
sounds like it.
For many, many years worked side by side.
So you work your way through your teen years and through the newspaper and the movie theater, and then
graduation from high school, out of here. No, I call it my wanderlust because I think it started really early. In kindergarten, I had a good friend, my best friend in that time, was Jewish. Her parents were immigrants. I'm not sure from where, maybe Russia. And they didn't speak English very well. But I remember going into her house and smelling the matzahs warming on the stove and seeing these blue airmail letters on the table and in funny calligraphy. And I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to know what that was all about. So I just was really interested in traveling from the beginning. And then my mom would kind of encourage that. She would take us periodically to I would think maybe Redlands University or San Bernardino to plays and musicals.
Oh, nice.
And so that was a whole new world.
Right. Are you the oldest? Or
I'm the oldest.
You're
yes.
the oldest.
I had one younger brother.
One younger brother. Oh, that's like me. Yeah.
So then you know how younger brothers.
I do.
So, and then a trip across country in an Airstream trailer with the Hatch family, Liz Meyer's family.
Liz Meyer, right.
Really opened up my vistas. You can imagine this, little Twentynine Palms girl seeing Native Americans in Arizona and New Mexico and seeing a colored sign on the toilets and the drinking fountains. And we were just like, how can that be, Sure. And so I think that probably skewed me towards a little bit liberal thinking. And then on that trip, we went all the way to Washington, D.C. and New York. So I saw amazing things and took an airplane home. So
do you remember what year that was?
I was just going into junior high, so it was
60s?
early 50s.
Early 50s. Okay,
yeah.
wow. Because I'm trying to think about like Washington, D.C. and New York at that time and what that would have been like.
Yeah, it was still the good old days.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So when you left here, did you leave and go to college? Did you leave and just say, I'm just going to travel around and then decide to go? How did that all go down?
Well, I went to college. I went to Scripps College in Claremont, largely influenced by Liz Hatchmeyer's mother. She had gone to Scripps and took us to visit, and it was a gorgeous campus. It was lovely, and I didn't even apply anywhere else, I don't think. So, and I didn't go that far from home. It's only 2 hours away. From then on, I did come home for summers and whatnot, but then early met Mike, my husband. He was at the Claremont Graduate School, and we wanted to travel. We knew that, and we sort of found our life partnership with this wanderlust.
Yeah.
I was married after my junior year. So I finished at Scripps, and then we went off to D.C., where he joined the State Department Foreign Service.
Oh.
And our first post was Belgrade, Yugoslavia, when it was Yugoslavia. We came back for only a very short time and then went off to Vienna, Austria for 2 years. So we had just fabulous experience for young people, and during that time our 2 daughters were born. So it was just a very exciting time. We learned new languages and we made friends from a lot of different places and got to travel a lot of other places.
It just really expands your view of the world and humanity, I think, when you can go outside of where you've always been.
That's why I say it's a good place to leave, because I believe that travel is probably the best education that any kid could get. And I was fortunate to be able to do it in those sort of cushioned circumstances. We had a job, we had an income, we had a place to live. And it was fun.
So then at some point you made a decision to go back to school?
I did. I was working as a graphic designer in D.C., and I was working with nonprofit groups, arts groups, having fun, but I realized, I guess it was my midlife, reassessment? Not really a crisis, but does everybody kind
What's
of
my next act?
At 35 think, what am I doing? Am I going to do this the rest of my life? And so I figured out that what I wanted to do was study architecture, be an architect. And it was fortunate that at that point in his career, Mike could be sent as a diplomat in residence to one of the military academies. And he chose the Air Force Academy because there was a really good, it was a wonderful post, first of all, but there was a good program at University of Colorado in Denver for a 3-year master's in architecture. So that worked out very nicely.
Yeah.
And then we went back to D.C. and at that point decided that we would stay there. He left the Foreign Service and because we wanted our kids to finish high school in one place, not be carting them all around the world.
Right.
And I was keen to start my career, so.
Sure. Did you live in D.C. proper, or did you? Oh, you did. Okay.
Yeah. I worked in D.C. My first and only office that I worked through did primarily healthcare facilities. Oh. And whereas I had been really interested in sustainability and green design, those terms weren't in service yet at that
LEED
time.
certified. Blah,
Yeah,
blah,
that came later. But when I was studying in Colorado, we were thinking a lot about passive design and passive solar and relying on climate.
What does that mean when you say passive?
Passive.
Yeah, passive climate.
It means rather than using machines and mechanical things to cool, you design so that you're taking advantage of natural breezes and shade and designing with the climate rather than against the climate. Okay. But once I got back to D.C., I learned that wasn't really happening in the professional world at that time, unfortunately. So I kind of changed my viewpoint to focus more on sort of social issues in a way. The firm I worked for did primarily healthcare facilities, and so I kind of got to be the specialist on aging and, assisted living, that kind of thing. We did a lot of hospitals and nursing homes and things like that.
What do you think it was that drew you to that type of architecture?
was the job I got.
Oh, okay. Well, that answers that.
Yeah. Well, I think I chose the firm because it was perfect size. It was a very small firm. I interviewed with some big firms, and it didn't appeal to me.
Didn't feel good.
I certainly didn't want to do private homes. I never wanted to do that. I wanted to do more public-oriented projects.
Okay.
When I saw that the boss would go in and run his own blueprints, I thought, okay, this is a place that I can fit in. So, and I was at least probably his same age, the boss's age, but he'd been, obviously working for many more years.
Were there many other women in the firm or in that?
Yeah. It was a very small firm. There were only 5 or 6 of us.
Mm-hmm. How about when you went to school?
Actually, in school, it was over half.
Oh, okay. Wow.
In
That's
that time.
pretty good.
So that was in the early 80s.
Okay.
So, and I think it's continuing to improve. It wasn't quite so common once I got back to D.C. and was working in D.C. Even though the firm was focusing on healthcare facilities, and I did enjoy that part of it, on my own time I was doing things pro bono for some public interest groups. I worked with some women's groups. I worked with one particular group called Community Family Life Services that was working on housing and employment for people in D.C. That turned out to be a lot of fun. We did a restaurant at 3rd and E Streets in D.C. that trained unemployed people for jobs in food service. And I did a 35-unit single-room occupancy residence. An SRO is what people would recognize.
I'm familiar with that from downtown L.A.
Yeah. It was still in its kind of early stages at that point. It wasn't as common, I don't think, as it was. But all of these were renovations of old buildings. So that SRO provided a room and holistic counseling services for homeless individuals. And I really was enjoying that part of it. So ultimately, I did go out on my own and focus only on sort of public service projects.
Nice.
The last project I finished just before I moved back here permanently was the renovation of an old apartment building for homeless, mentally ill women, and that was very specialized. I learned a lot about what you can and can't put into a residence for someone who's
Can you
mentally
talk
ill.
a little bit about some of those things?
Probably shouldn't.
Oh,
well,
okay.
I mean, simple things like mirrors. You don't put a glass mirror in if somebody's, you have shower curtain rods that break away if somebody tried, not always pleasant things to think about.
No, but I wouldn't have ever thought of that myself. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't think any other people would realize that needs to, be considered.
It was quite an education for me.
Yeah, for sure.
So my mom was still here in those days, still living in the house that I grew up in. After we moved from the homestead. I should have talked about that, I guess.
Yeah, let's go back to moving from the homestead to the next house.
Okay. When we learned that the Marine Corps base was coming to Twentynine Palms, my dad said, oh, wow, this town's really going to take off. This is going to be a big town. So he bought property down across from the post office and started building a drive-in theater and a roller rink. And ultimately, we had a twin drive-in theater, 2 screens, and the roller rink. So it was not practical to be living up at the homestead if we were working all night, basically.
Oh, yeah.
And the base was coming. We thought the town was going to boom. He thought the town was going to boom.
Yeah.
So he bought a large house in the center of town, and that's where I've lived the rest of my life, and my mom lived the rest of her life. And in fact, we still own it. It's an Airbnb now. We live next door to it. So as Mom was aging, I was coming back more frequently and staying longer, and finally it became clear to me that as much as I loved where we were living, which at that time we had moved from D.C. to Annapolis, which is a lovely place to live, I was meant to be a West Coast girl, and it got harder and harder to go home. So Mike and I made the decision that I would move out here. I would move here permanently, and he would work in Washington until he could retire. As I was coming out here, I was getting in touch with Jerry Hagman and Jerry Mattis, who were starting to work on a scheme for an observatory and nature center. And my first reaction was, well, I have never done anything like that. I don't think I could do that. But when I found out all that they had in mind, and
you mean like design the plans, like an architect would do? Yeah, okay.
Because I had never done
now an
anything
observatory,
like that. I saw the property, we talked about the ideas, and I decided that this was really something I could get behind. The site is wonderful. It's right on the border of Joshua Tree National Park, above my dad's homestead. And I was getting more and more involved with that, and so it became clear that I somehow was meant to come home, and that's what I feel I've done, is come home. So we've been here about 14 years now.
Where was Mike from originally?
He was from Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Okay, so when he moved out here, like, I mean, coming to visit is one thing, but then moving here permanently, how was that for him?
Well, he came out for graduate school in Claremont and fell in love with California. We stuck around a little bit, worked here for a while until he joined the Foreign Service, and then we went back to D.C. But we've never contemplated living in Fort Wayne, I can tell you. It's a lovely town. It's a very, very forward-thinking town. But,
so now you're still working with Sky's the Limit,
yes,
right?
Yes. In fact, I'm president right now, even though I'm not an astronomer. But it's a very compelling program and project. And
they have a lot going on out there. And then when we were communicating to try and even book this interview, you were like, we just finished a star party with 40 international journalists or whatever.
It's true.
That's amazing.
Yeah, people are starting to discover us, I guess. And we aren't a very big bunch of people. I mean, a very small organization. So everybody's kind of got to do everything. And I decided that I would love to be kind of in charge of this, heading this up. And so I don't know anything about telescopes or
well, you have a little bit of business experience, though, right?
Anyway, but we have a great organization, volunteer organization, and just keeps getting better and better. I mean, that we have a star party every Saturday night that the moon is not full, and people come from all over. I mean, especially in the summer when Americans don't travel to the desert, Europeans travel to the desert. So we have great crowds during the summer, and it's just a lot of fun to be beside somebody who's looking through a telescope for the first time.
That is one of my greatest joys. I've been not necessarily at the observatory, but at different places like the Retreat Center or even something like a Bhakti or Shakti Fest, and people come in from out of town, and maybe we have an amazing sunset that night, and you just see the joy, and they're just in awe of how beautiful this place is, and it makes me so proud to be here and to be able to share that with other people.
That's exactly right.
And then I think, I get to stay here all the time. It's wonderful.
Yeah, this last group that we had last week was an international group who had just been at a big convention in Los Angeles and had broken into smaller groups that were traveling around. And the desert group came here. We had an amazing time. I mean, they loved it, absolutely loved it. They didn't want to leave.
I'm sure. Well, that happens too. So if someone were to say to you, Anne, I'm thinking about moving to the desert, what are some things that you would say to them about that decision?
I think it's a great idea, but think about it really long and hard. Spend some time here. I think you'll be captivated, and you will love living here. It's not easy, but what is? I mean, anything worth having is not easy. And we have the most beautiful nights. We have the most beautiful sunsets. Yeah. For the most part, our weather is fine. Yeah. It's not so good right now. Right. It's a little warm.
I call it lockdown season. By 10 o'clock, all the blinds are pulled so that, you can keep it cool inside. And then, 6 o'clock, you can start to open things
up
back
again,
up again. Yeah. Right. It was so interesting reading Elizabeth Campbell's book, because there were so many similar through lines, like just something that simple about them also shutting things down during the day when it was really hot and then reopening things up for the cool air in the night. And it was just kind of cool to think that people have been living this way for a really long time.
And I will say that that's informing our plans for the ultimate buildings on the observatory. We will have 2 large buildings, for starters, 2 large buildings that will include classrooms and research facilities and an auditorium room with a big telescope dome in the center. Oh my gosh. And all of the things that I'm putting into that design or thinking about in that design have to do with passive strategies that desert people know. And hopefully we'll be totally off the grid and be very, very green for the desert.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad to have you here. But before we go... Oh. Random questions.
Okay.
Would you choose 4 numbers between 1 and 50? And that is for the Diary Unlocked episode that I will generously give to my Patreon supporters who are so generously supporting this podcast. And if you're listening and you would like to support the podcast in that way, I would like you to go to desertladydiaries.com, click on the support page, and select the Patreon option. Your numbers, please.
4 numbers?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, 9, 17, 25, and 46. Oh, is that right? Okay.
4.
Okay. You said under 50, right?
Yes, 1 and 50. So I'm going to read the questions, and you can think about them because I'll repeat them when we get on the other side to the juicy part of the podcast. Okay, so the first one will be, what keeps you up at night? The next one is, in your lifetime, has there been a relationship or job you stayed in too long? How did you decide to move on?
Ooh.
Then we'll go to, since coming to the desert, or since coming back to the desert, what have you been surprised to discover about yourself? And the last one will be, what is your greatest extravagance? So, if you would like to hear Anne's answers to those questions, go out to desertladydiaries.com and sign up to be a Patreon supporter. Thank you very much for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me. This was fun.
I'm glad.
I loved hearing Anne's memories of working for the family businesses and feel so lucky and privileged to be so close to the history of this place, which doesn't seem like it was that long ago. If you're interested in coming out to experience the night sky at Sky's the Limit, mark your calendar for September 21st. That's the date for the Night Sky Festival at the observatory. Or go out to nightskyfestival.org, check out the event and the schedule. Sounds like a lot of fun. I have shout-outs this week to Nora S. Thank you so much for your donation and for your kind words about the podcast. Nora says, thank you so much for the great podcast. I hope to move out to the desert one day. Well, Nora, even if you just come back to visit, I hope you'll get in touch. I appreciate you. I also have a shout out to Leslie from Maryland. Thank you so much for listening. And Andre MC, appreciate you both signing up for the weekly newsletter. Thank you. And if you don't want to miss an episode, sign up for the weekly newsletter like Leslie and Andre. Go to desertladydiaries.com and click on the button that says weekly newsletter. It's really that easy. Have you checked out the Simultaneous Times podcast yet? I'd love to hear what you think about it. In the meantime, here's Jean-Paul to tell you about it.
Science fiction stories and interviews blasting straight out of the Mojave Desert and beyond. Space Cowboy Books presents Simultaneous Times Podcast. Free to stream on your favorite podcast player. Find out more at spacecowboybooks.com and be sure to visit our store in Joshua Tree, California.
See you back here next week. Thank you so much for listening.